Emma's frustration boiled over when she realized that the empty wine glass beside her seat wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate slight. In a premium section where every other guest was being treated with warmth and courtesy, she knew this wasn't just a simple oversight. Choosing not to ignore the insult, she took a silent stand, setting in motion events she never anticipated. Seated in an elegant, well-lit cabin, Emma took in every dismissive glance, every request that went unanswered, and the subtle but stinging avoidance by the crew. The quiet murmur of surrounding conversations faded as her mind raced. She wasn't imagining it. This was personal. Instead of brushing it off like so many times before, she started taking notes, documenting every instance of mistreatment. A choice that would soon send shockwaves beyond that plane. What began as one instance of neglect spiraled into something much larger, an undeniable confrontation with discrimination. The kind that quietly persists in places meant for privilege and comfort. This was no longer just about her. It was about breaking a pattern of exclusion that had gone unnoticed for too long. Emma boarded the aircraft with the weight of past experiences pressing on her. She had dealt with subtle slights and undercurrents of bias before, but today was different. Today, she was determined to push back. Taking her seat, she adjusted her blazer, every inch of her appearance reflecting the professional she had worked so hard to become. Yet, beneath the composed exterior, memories surfaced, moments in courtrooms and conference halls where she had to prove herself twice over. This flight, however, was an entirely new battleground, and she wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. A low murmur filled the cabin as the flight attendants moved through the aisles, serving passengers with polished ease. Emma's sharp eyes caught an undeniable pattern. Every guest around her received drinks and polite conversation while her presence was ignored. She watched as the passenger next to her, a businessman in a tailored suit, accepted a glass of fine wine with a smile. Her pulse quickened. Methodically, she recorded every moment. The turned backs, the dismissive nods, the practiced indifference. Then, something unexpected happened. "Did you notice that?" A voice beside her asked quietly. She turned to see an older woman watching the scene with a knowing expression. The stranger's simple acknowledgement was a lifeline. "Yes," Emma responded, meeting her gaze. The woman nodded. "You're not imagining it, and you shouldn't let it go." Validation. In that moment, Emma felt a shift. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. Determined, Emma pressed the service button. When the flight attendant finally approached, Emma spoke with measured control. "I'd like to understand why I haven't been served the same as the other passengers," she said firmly. The attendant hesitated, offering a half-hearted apology wrapped in vague justifications. Emma held her gaze, refusing to let the moment slip away. "I expect to be treated with the same respect as everyone else here." The surrounding passengers began to take notice. A few heads turned, and the air in the cabin subtly shifted. The flight attendant's discomfort was evident, but Emma knew that discomfort was necessary. As the flight continued, Emma reflected on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about a drink or a single slight. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that subtle forms of bias were exposed, even in spaces where they were least expected. When the plane landed, she didn't rush off like the others. Instead, she made her way to a quiet spot in the terminal and pulled out her phone. A message from a trusted colleague was waiting. "Call me. Let's do something about this." She took a deep breath and dialed. What happened next was beyond what she had anticipated. The legal team she consulted saw the case for what it was, an opportunity to push for real change. Calls were made. Airline executives were looped in. Policies were questioned. Meetings were set. In a tense boardroom discussion days later, Emma sat across from airline representatives, her expression unreadable, but her voice unwavering. "I want to ensure that no passenger has to experience what I did. This is not a request. It's an expectation." Her words cut through the excuses. Within days, changes began taking shape. Training programs were revised, service guidelines rewritten, and new policies were enforced to ensure every customer received the respect they deserved. Months later, standing at a podium addressing a room full of industry professionals, Emma spoke with the confidence of someone who had turned an isolated moment into a movement. "We have a responsibility," she said, scanning the audience, "to make sure that respect is not a luxury, but a standard." Her journey had begun with a single moment of defiance, but had become so much more, a fight for dignity that would echo far beyond one flight, one airline, or one experience. This was just the beginning. Months had passed since that fateful flight, yet Emma's determination remained unshaken. What had begun as a moment of quiet defiance had grown into a movement that challenged an industry reluctant to change. She no longer saw herself merely as a passenger fighting for respect. She had become a symbol of advocacy, standing for those who had been dismissed and overlooked. Her battle was far from over, but the progress was undeniable. Major airlines had taken notice. Industry panels now discussed the very issues that had once been swept under the rug. Policies were being rewritten, training programs revamped, and employees educated on the subtle, yet significant biases that could make someone feel invisible. Emma's actions had become a catalyst for a much-needed reckoning. Standing before a packed auditorium of industry leaders, legal professionals, and fellow advocates, she took a deep breath. The weight of the journey that had brought her here pressed against her shoulders, but so did the immense responsibility of the moment. "When I first boarded that plane, I didn't intend to become a voice for change," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I simply expected to be treated with the same dignity as everyone else. But when that dignity was denied, I had a choice, to accept it or to challenge it." She paused, scanning the faces before her. Some were nodding in agreement, while others listened intently, their expressions unreadable. We often think discrimination is loud, obvious, impossible to ignore. But more often, it's quiet. It's the way some people are overlooked while others are prioritized. It's the small, calculated omissions that send a message that you don't belong. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. She continued, her conviction growing. "I fought back not just for myself, but for every traveler who has ever been made to feel less than. And I'm here today because no one should have to demand the basic respect they deserve." The applause that followed was not just polite acknowledgement. It was a signal that her words had resonated. That change was not just possible, but necessary. After the event, Emma was approached by airline executives who had once been hesitant to acknowledge the problem. Now, they wanted her input. They wanted solutions. This, she realized, was what true progress looked like. Not just policies rewritten, but perspectives shifted. That night, as she sat in her hotel room overlooking the city skyline, Emma reflected on how far she had come. She had turned a moment of exclusion into a movement for equity. The work was not finished, but she had proven that even the smallest act of resistance could lead to systemic change. Her story wasn't just about one flight, one injustice, or one industry. It was about the power of speaking up, about how a single voice, when determined enough, could create an echo that would never fade.